Welcome to this latest edition of our Workbench blog and all the news, updates and modelling exclusives from the fascinating world of Airfix. After last weekend's Bumper Battle of Britain 85th Anniversary Edition and Hawker Hurricane linked feature in Airfix Aerodrome, we're taking things just a little bit easier this week for a number of reasons, mainly scheduling and holiday related. That being said, there is no let-up with regard to Workbench exclusives, as we have an appealing new selection of built model images to bring you this time around. As we continue to retain a subject link with the Battle of Britain, or at least with one of the aircraft types which contested this aerial duel, we will be revisiting a subject covered just a few weeks ago, not just because we now have built model images which weren't available at the time of previously posting, but because the kit is now in stock and available and is, in our opinion, unquestionably one of the most appealing kit releases of the year. Our latest Heinkel He 111 kit release presents this famous bomber in H6 torpedo carrying variant configuration. However, modelers looking to produce a scale tribute to the Luftwaffe's most famous bomber currently have two individual kit options available on the Airfix website. We will be including details of both kits and their featured scheme detail options in this latest update. We have double Heinkel He 111 kit. Release updates for you in this latest aviation Wolf in Sheep's Clothing edition of Workbench. The modelling of scale representations of aircraft tracing their lineage back to the tumultuous years of the 1930s has been a popular subject since the very beginning of our hobby, and continues to be so to this day. That was a time when most of Europe was attempting to put the horrors of the Great War behind them, despite the fact Europe appeared to be moving inexorably towards conflict once again, one which could potentially be even more devastating than the previous one. Senior military planners who were guiding the reunification of Germany were not alone in their convictions that air power would have a significant role to play in any future conflict, and were determined that the new Luftwaffe would be ready and equipped when their services were called upon. Working under the restrictions imposed by the conditions of the Treaty of Versailles, German aircraft manufacturers produced a succession of designs which were promoted to the outside world as advanced passenger and transport aircraft, but were clearly capable of being used with more sinister offensive intentions. Crucially, all this clandestine work was giving the German aviation industry valuable experience in not only designing high-tech, world-leading aeroplanes, but also in perfecting methods for the effective mass production of such machines, clearly a more overt indication of their actual intentions. The Heinkel Aviation Company were amongst the most accomplished aircraft design and manufacturing companies in the world during the 1930s, producing a succession of designs to compete for most contracts issued in Germany during this period. One of their most successful aircraft was the single-engined Heinkel He III Blitz, Lightning, four-seat touring aeroplane, a machine which was extremely distinctive in appearance, and one which would go on to set several significant aviation records from the moment it first took to the air. Many of its distinctive design features would later be seen in a later, slightly larger design, an aircraft which would go on to become one of the most famous aircraft of the Second World War. It would also become synonymous with the might of an all-conquering Luftwaffe rampaging its way across Europe, the Heinkel He 111 medium bomber. The Heinkel Company initially referred to their new aircraft as the Doppelblitz, double Blitz, as it was, for the want of a better description, a larger twin-engined version of their existing He 70. The new design retained the large and distinctive elliptical wing of its predecessor, and also adopted something of a traditional stepped layout for the main fuselage design. It was an attempt to produce a fast and sleek modern aircraft to capture the world speed record for a civilian aircraft, and whilst it was outwardly presented as an airliner/transport aircraft to remain within the conditions imposed by the Treaty of Versailles, its impressive performance suggested it may possess more sinister intentions. The aircraft made its first flight in February 1935 and was found to possess exceptional handling characteristics, particularly at lower speeds, something which made both landing and taking off relatively trouble-free for pilots. This aircraft and the ones which immediately followed it would be passed over to Lufthansa in an attempt to continue the civilian aviation subterfuge, with the type being unveiled to the German public and wider aviation world at Berlin Tempelhof Aerodrome on 10th January 1936. By this time, development of the military version of the aircraft was well underway, with Germany now no longer concerned with attempting to conceal such military ambitions from other European nations. Germany's secret bombers were secret no more, and Europe was on course for war. The earliest versions of the Heinkel He III were quite different in appearance from the aircraft which took part in the Battle of Britain and the profile which many people associate with this famous bomber, although still adopting the large whale-like fuselage, distinctive elliptical wings and horizontal stabilizers. The nose of the bomber was very different, as it was longer and more pointed in appearance, arguably of a much more traditional design. Although these early machines did now feature the machine guns which clearly identified it as a military aircraft, it has to be said that the aircraft wasn't exactly bristling with defensive armament, as this was one of the fastest aircraft in the world at that time, capable of outrunning most of the fighter aircraft in service with the world's air forces. Luftwaffe officials didn't envisage their new bomber having to defend itself against enemy fighter attack, and therefore only equipped them with just 3 light machine guns to deal with any such unexpected aerial challenges. An incredible wartime survivor, Heinkel He III, P1 number 1526, is on display at the Norwegian Armed Forces Aircraft Collection at Gardermoen near Oslo, and was the aircraft we LiDAR scanned at the outset of this project. From the Heinkel He I11P model variant onwards, the bomber underwent a significant design change, one which would see it inheriting arguably its most iconic and distinctive features, along with a host of other incremental upgrades and improvements. Now adopting the ubiquitous Daimler-Benz DB601 engine as its power plant, this variant also saw the introduction of a redesigned cockpit and front fuselage section, an upgrade which made for a roomier, more streamlined working environment for both the pilot and his bomb aimer. This development certainly gave the aircraft something of a sleeker visual appearance, along with improving general visibility for its crews. With this shorter, taller nose section now being completely glazed, the famous Heinkel He I11 had its most distinctive feature, one which would make it amongst the most recognizable aircraft of the entire Second World War, and the backbone of Luftwaffe bomber operations. In addition to giving the Heinkel its unmistakable profile, the new fully glazed cockpit section clearly afforded the pilot a much improved field of view. However, there was a price to pay. Having the crew clearly visible made them a tempting target for enemy fighter attack, with the unfortunate crew afforded very little in the way of protection in such circumstances. And during the Battle of Britain, it was quickly discovered that these bombers required fighter protection when operating in contested airspace. Despite sweeping all before them during the early stages of the Second World War, the Battle of Britain would prove to be nothing short of devastating for Luftwaffe Heinkel crews. As the advantages in speed and manoeuvrability the aircraft had possessed when it first entered service had now been overtaken by the latest breed of fighter aircraft. Heinkel bombers operating over Britain had little chance against Spitfires and Hurricanes unless they were themselves protected by swarms of Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighters or operating under cover of darkness. Although essentially obsolete as a strike bomber operating in contested airspace from the summer of 1940 onwards, the Heinkel would be forced to soldier on in a variety of offensive roles for the remainder of the war, with around 6,500 of these distinctive bombers having been produced by the time the final bomber rolled off the production line in September 1944, making its combat introduction during the Spanish Civil War in 1937. The Heinkel He III would continue in its role as the Luftwaffe's main strike bomber for the remainder of the war and serve in every theatre of war contested by Germany during that time. It would be used as a night fighter on the Eastern Front, be used to air launch V-1 Doodlebugs, and remain in service with the Spanish Air Force until the 1970s. As we can see, in addition to making for an impressive model build project, there is much more to the Luftwaffe's wolf in sheep's clothing than initially meets the eye, and how this aircraft possesses a history which deserves to be preserved and promoted, even if only in scale modelling circles. As one of the most famous aircraft to see service during the Second World War, the Heinkel He III bomber has always been a popular subject with the world's modelling community since the very establishment of the hobby, and has been a feature of the Airfix range since the early 1960s. Since the introduction of that first 1/72nd scale kit, with its interesting shape and historic notoriety, it has to be considered one of the most popular kit subjects in our history, and has probably been built by hundreds of thousands of modellers since that time. An aircraft which, along with the Messerschmitt Bf 109 and Ju 87 Stuka, would become the very embodiment of German military aviation, might during the Second World War, the Heinkel He III has always been staple modelling fare within our beloved hobby, perhaps because it is such a distinctive-looking aircraft, but maybe also by virtue of the fact that so few examples remained after the war, with even less subsequently finding their way into museum collections around the world. This type's rarity has certainly cemented the Heinkel's legacy as a popular modelling project over the years. Due to the length of time this original kit spent in the range, and the enduring popularity of the aircraft as a modelling subject, the Heinkel He III attracted the attentions of a new breed of Airfix product designers back in 2014, who felt that a subject of this pedigree was deserving of a design revisit, and a new kit benefiting from all the latest design innovations the industry had to offer. Announced with the launch of our 2015 kit range, the new Heinkel He III tooling would actually be featured in just the 5th edition of the then very new Workbench blog, where we exclusively revealed CAD imagery of the additional component frames introduced to allow the Junkers Jumo 211-powered H variant of the bomber to be produced. Arguably the most effective version of the famous Heinkel He III series of bombers, and certainly the one which was built in the greatest numbers, the H series attempted to address many of the shortcomings which were evident on earlier models of the bomber, in addition to upgrading the general performance and combat survivability of this widely used Luftwaffe aircraft. Although the Heinkel He III could no longer claim to be an entirely effective attack bomber on the Western Front following the losses experienced during the Battle of Britain, it would go on to serve with distinction in a variety of different roles, and in every theatre of operations where Luftwaffe aircraft flew. Successive upgrades enabled the aircraft to deliver a more effective weapons payload over greater distances, whilst at the same time providing Heinkel crews with much more effective defensive armament. The internal weapons bay was no longer used to carry bombs, but was instead converted to house additional fuel and oil tanks, allowing for much longer sorties to be mounted, many of which would be over water. This development also allowed these later Heinkels to carry larger, more devastating weapons from external hardpoints, which included air-launched torpedoes and the SC 1,000-2,200-pound Hermann bomb. The latest release from this relatively new and incredibly popular tooling is available now and includes two interesting schemes which mark the different offensive ordnance options, crews flying this variant of the aircraft had available to them. Perhaps the most interesting missions carried out by H-model Heinkel He 111s were those of the torpedo-carrying maritime attack bombers, aircraft which flew at wave-top height before delivering their payload of 2 air-launched LTF-5B torpedoes against their target vessels. Operating from the airfield at Bardufoss in northern Norway, the anti-shipping Heinkels of KG-26 were involved in the infamous attack against Arctic convoy PQ-17, an episode which proved to be one of the most disastrous episodes in the history of the Royal Navy. Leaving Iceland, bound for Arkhangelsk in Russia, the convoy consisted of 35 merchant vessels and a large protecting force of naval ships. Historically, these convoys had been established to provide the Soviet Union with a constant stream of weapons and supplies in the wake of the German invasion of their country, allowing them to remain in the war and to keep German forces committed to combat in their country. Bringing everything from tanks and aircraft to bullets and shells, the Germans knew only too well what the British were attempting to do, and knew that if the supplies reached Russia, they would take a heavy toll of their forces. But if they could be destroyed at sea, how a great many German lives could be saved. Convoy PQ-17 was the largest Arctic convoy ever assembled to date, which for the first time brought together warships of both the British and American navies to protect a massive shipment of war supplies for Russia. The Germans knew about the convoy and were determined to prevent these supplies from getting through, assembling a mighty force of aircraft, submarines and surface ships to be hurled against it. The scene was set for a monumental clash and an unprecedented British naval disaster. Once detected by the shadowing Germans, and when it was within striking range, the first attack came from a large force of Heinkel He 111 torpedo bombers from KG-26. Warned of their approach, the escort vessels put up a murderous wall of defensive anti-aircraft fire, which claimed 4 of the Luftwaffe bombers destroyed. Determined in their attack, the torpedoes did their damage, and several ships were sunk, and the defensive shield of the convoy disrupted. A second wave of aircraft was even more determined, but the warship ring again put up accurate defensive fire, ensuring that all but the most committed of Luftwaffe pilots would have found it difficult to execute their attacks effectively. Back in Britain, the Admiralty started to receive reports claiming that the mighty German battleship Tirpitz had left port and was steaming towards the convoy. Despite the strength of the force protecting convoy PQ-17, senior officials knew that if challenged by Tirpitz, many of the ships would be lost. So in one of the most tragic decisions of the entire war, Allied warships were ordered to return to port, with the merchant convoys simultaneously being ordered to scatter and make for Arkhangelsk alone. In some of the most inhospitable seas in the world, and with hundreds of miles still to negotiate, the Admiralty essentially abandoned convoy PQ-17 to their fate. Over the next few days, the German air and submarine attacks on the merchant vessels were relentless, but in some way, the order to scatter did make their job more difficult. Nevertheless, 24 vessels from the convoy were sunk, and just 11 extremely overdue ships eventually made it to Arkhangelsk or Murmansk, which proved to be a miracle in itself. A devastating loss for the Allies, official sources claim that only 5 Luftwaffe aircraft were lost during these operations, and significantly, Tirpitz did not put to sea throughout the entire attack. The scheme option presented here marks one of the 26 Heinkel He 111 bombers, which took part in the largest air attack against the convoy on 4th July 1942, the final air attack of the day. Pilot Lieutenant Konrad Hennemann flew his aircraft low over the sea, having selected his target, the SS Navarino, releasing a single LTF-5B torpedo towards the ship in his sights. The torpedo slammed into the merchant ship, causing absolute devastation, but not before accurate anti-aircraft fire from the destroyer ring had crippled the attacking Heinkel. The aircraft hit the water and disintegrated, with the crew later being listed as missing in action. Pilot Konrad Hennemann would later be posthumously awarded the Knight's Cross for his bravery under fire, an aircraft type which would see service in every theatre the German Luftwaffe contested. Elements of KG-100 were sent to southern Europe in April 1942 to operate from the airfield at Athens Kalamaki. From there, the unit's Heinkel bombers were in a position to cause havoc across the entire Mediterranean, mounting long-range strikes against Allied-held ports, enemy shipping, and strategic targets as far away as North Africa. The H-6 variant of the Heinkel did not employ internal bomb bays, but instead had two robust ordnance hardpoints fitted beneath the forward fuselage, which were capable of accepting a wide variety of stores, including the SC-1000 general-purpose bomb, which was colloquially referred to as the Hermann. It's open to interpretation as to whether this was a term of endearment or simply reference to the rather portly appearance of these bombs, an appearance which was likened to the physique of their commander-in-chief. These bombs were designed for maximum blast effect, used to shatter industrial infrastructure, such as docks, airfields, and production facilities, but could also be incredibly effective when used against shipping, even if the bomb only exploded near its intended target. On the evening of the 24th of April 1942, 6 Heinkel HE-111s of 2/KG-26, along with 5 Junkers Ju-88s from 1/LG-1 and a Heinkel from KG-26 acting as the Force Pathfinder, carried out a bombing attack against the British-held airfield complex at Kotafia, 2 in Egypt. Although the raid did cause significant disruption at the airfield, only 2 Wellingtons of No. 70 Squadron were damaged, resulting in it only being a partially successful raid. The aircraft covered in this scheme option took part in the attack, but was struck by the airfield's anti-aircraft defences on the run into the target, damaging it sufficiently to cause the aircraft to crash into the desert sands nearby. Tragically, the 4-man crew all perished in the crash and were officially posted as being missing in action. This aircraft is unusual in its presentation and therefore of great interest to the modeller. These non-standard markings were applied after the aircraft had arrived in Greece and consisted of black undersides and large RLM-80 olive-green camouflage markings over RLM Sandgelb II. During the painting process, only the most vital identification markings were reapplied, making these aircraft particularly interesting. At the time this aircraft was lost, II/KG-100 were also using unorthodox fuselage codes, which is the reason why this aircraft carried the letter J in its coding, which denotes an aircraft allocated to 6 Staffel. The front section of the spinners are painted in red, marking this as a 2-Grupper aircraft. The unit operated from Athens Kalamaki airfield for just 11 days short of 1 year, during a particularly active period of air activity in this theatre of operations. As you can see, the above scheme descriptions have now been updated with the inclusion of the recently received built model images, completed in both scheme options. Not wanting to let this opportunity pass by, as we currently have no fewer than 3 Heinkel HE-111 kit offerings available on the Airfix website, we also wanted to revisit our current P2 variant offering and include the scheme options available with this kit, primarily because it hasn't featured here on Workbench for several years now. It also happens to mark the reissue of the first kit release produced from the newly designed Heinkel HE-111 tooling back in 2015, so is certainly worthy of inclusion here. One of the most historic aircraft currently residing in any of the world's aviation museums, this Heinkel was one of many German aircraft to be based and operated from Norway during the Second World War and despite having to make a forced landing in a snow-covered mountainous region of the country following combat with British Skua fighters, is now on display in magnificent restored condition. Heinkel He III P25J plus CN was assigned to Kampfgeschwader 4 General Weber, a unit which proudly carried the name of General Walter Weber, a senior German military official and pilot who was an outspoken champion in ensuring the new Luftwaffe would have a powerful strategic bombing force prior to the start of the Second World War. On the morning of the 26th of April 1940, this aircraft, along with 2 other Heinkel He-111s, took off from Oslo Fornebu airfield at the start of an armed reconnaissance mission, a mission which would prove to be rather eventful for all involved. Whilst the formation flew high over the Romsdalsfjord, 5J plus CN was struck by anti-aircraft fire from the British cruiser HMS Manchester, steaming in the waters below, but with the aircraft's crew oblivious to any damage to their aircraft, they continued on to bomb the railway station at the coastal town of Åndalsnes. Immediately following their bombing attack, the Luftwaffe formation was attacked by Blackburn Skuas from No. 810 Squadron Fleet Air Arm, which were operating from the carrier HMS Ark Royal. Whilst the other 2 bombers escaped unscathed, 5J plus CN was less fortunate, and during an intense dogfight, the Skuas inflicted significant damage on the German bomber, with 1 crew member killed and another sustaining significant injury. With the aircraft now on fire and with a seized engine, it began losing height at an alarming rate, leaving the pilot with no other option than to look for a suitable place to make a forced landing. With the aircraft flying over a snow-covered mountainous region of the country, the pilot had few options available to him and was forced to bring his aircraft down at Diggervarden, just south of Lesjaskog, where this fascinating story would take another twist. During the dogfight, the attacking Blackburn Skua sustained damage to its own engine, and after the fighter's crew had witnessed the Heinkel crash landing in the snow, they themselves now had to look for a place to put their own badly damaged aircraft down. That spot proved to be the frozen lake Breidalsvatnet, and after making a textbook belly landing, both pilot and his observer were fortunate to be able to walk away from the incident uninjured. They immediately set fire to their aircraft to prevent it from falling into enemy hands. But during the spring thaw in the months which followed, the wreckage slipped beneath the waters of the now unfrozen lake. As for the Heinkel, its wreckage lay relatively undisturbed for the remainder of the war, but following the end of hostilities, it didn't take long before it started to become something of a popular attraction with locals looking to bag themselves a war trophy. During the 1970s, following receipt of a detailed proposal prepared by the Norwegian Aviation History Association, the wreckage of Heinkel 5J plus CN was recovered from its mountainous resting place and taken to the Forsvarets Flysamling Gardermoen, where it would be the subject of a lengthy and painstaking restoration project to as near to its wartime configuration as could be achieved. This magnificent aircraft is now on display as part of the Norwegian Armed Forces Aircraft Collection, one of the rarest examples of a combat veteran wartime Luftwaffe aircraft to be found anywhere in the world. Heinkel He-111. Build number 1526 was constructed in 1938 as a P-2 variant of the bomber and would go on to play an active role in operations supporting the invasion of Norway, first flying from bases in northern Germany and later from captured airfields in Norway itself. She is now a beautifully restored example of this important aircraft type, one of the few combat veteran Heinkel bombers. Enthusiasts are able to see on public display anywhere in the world. Interestingly, the Blackburn Skua, which shot this Heinkel down, was also recovered from its Norwegian resting place during the 1970s and is now on display at the Fleet Air Arm Museum, Yeovilton. Fascinatingly, This is a rare occasion where two aircraft involved in the same combat engagement both made forced landings, but were both subsequently recovered to take their places in different aviation museums in Europe. Clearly, different things appeal to different people when deciding which kit will be taking its place on our workstations as our next build project. But if interesting wartime stories play a part in such decisions, then the details behind this particular Heinkel scheme will surely have this kit appearing on many a winter build schedule this year. With the H variant of the Heinkel He-111 having entered Luftwaffe service immediately prior to the invasion of Poland, this latest version of the bomber was in widespread service by the time of the Battle of Britain, and as a consequence, it was unusual, but not impossible to find earlier variants of the aircraft committed to combat operations over Britain. Up until this point in the war, the Heinkel He-111 had proved to be incredibly effective as a strike bomber, and so with their crews being supremely confident in their abilities, and with their commander's confidence of a swift victory against a depleted Royal Air Force ringing in their ears, they looked forward to continuing their successes over England. As we now know, this confidence was cruelly exposed as being wildly over-optimistic at best, and perhaps even bordering on complacency. For the first time, bomber crews would be operating over enemy territory, with the natural barrier of the English Channel making any technical problem or combat damage likely to at least knock them out of the war. Of even greater significance than this, they would now be coming up against a determined, well-organised enemy, one equipped with effective fighter aircraft, manned by well-trained pilots. Things were going to be very different over England. RAF fighters could return to their base, refuel, rearm, and be back in the fight almost before the bombers had turned for home themselves. And even if a British fighter was shot down, there was a possibility that the pilot could be back with their squadrons and in the air fighting again in just a matter of days. Now, for the first time, the Luftwaffe were not going to have all the odds stacked in their favour. In combat operations over Britain, the Heinkel proved to be extremely vulnerable to fighter attack, and if intercepted by the RAF, without the support of their own fighters, the Heinkel was certainly at a huge disadvantage and would suffer terrible losses at the hands of fighter commands Spitfires and Hurricanes. Despite the bombers' chastening experience during the fighting over Britain, they would go on to see service throughout the rest of the war with varying degrees of success. But in the knowledge that it was now outclassed as a daylight bomber type when operating in contested airspace, particularly when facing a determined and well-equipped enemy force. The lack of a suitable upgraded replacement aircraft would also prove to be a major contributory factor in the Luftwaffe's failure to gain a strategic advantage during the rest of the war, placing an increasing German reliance on the introduction of technologically advanced wonder weapons in an attempt to stem the tide of Allied military supremacy. The particular Heinkel presented here has to be considered one of the most distinctive and interesting aircraft of its type in the entire war, by virtue of the impressive and unique artwork carried on both sides of the aircraft's rudder. Although a rather famous Kampfgeschwader 55 Greif Heinkel He-111 carrying the fuselage codes G1 plus HP did operate over Britain during the Battle of Britain and would actually fall into British hands, it wasn't this aircraft. Research shows that this aircraft, Werk number 1992, didn't make it to the air operations against Britain. It's thought that this Heinkel was brought down by RAF Hawker Hurricanes of numbers 1 and 73 squadrons during the Battle of France, with the bomber crashing and burning out on farmland between the towns of Mary and Amblemont in northern France, close to the border with Belgium. Although spectacular, the origins of the rudder artwork remain something of a mystery, so if any Workbench reader has information which might shed some definitive light on this fascinating subject, we would be extremely interested to hear from you. As a modelling subject, the Heinkel He-111 possesses huge appeal, and has to be considered one of the most popular subjects our hobby has known over the years. The unmistakable profile of this famous Luftwaffe bomber would make for an appealing addition to any model collection, with the large elliptical wings of the bomber ensuring it will be receiving plenty of admiring glances when it does. As mentioned previously, the current Airfix range actually includes 3 different kit options featuring the Heinkel He III, with this P2 kit being joined by the new H6 attack against convoy PQ-17 and the one featured in the hugely popular Battle of Britain gift set, which also includes this Heinkel kit. All are in 1/72nd scale, and all feature the most recent tooling incarnation of this most famous of fighting aeroplanes. As far as winter build projects go, can you think of a more appealing subject, particularly in this Battle of Britain anniversary year? 2025 is definitely the airfix year of the Heinkel He-11, the famous German wartime bomber, which started out pretending to be a passenger transport aircraft for Lufthansa. Thanks for watching and for spending some time with us as we explored another fascinating story from aviation history and the world of scale modelling. We appreciate your support and hope you'll join us again for the next edition. This podcast was made using an AI voice from a script carefully written by a human.